I stood over hundreds of dangerous men throughout my long career in law enforcement, yet nothing ever prepared me for the quiet horror of watching my own flesh and blood get physically degraded right in front of my face across a brightly lit restaurant table. I did not scream, punch anyone, or make a loud scene in that crowded room. Making the choice to remain completely still in that precise moment was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it ultimately changed the entire trajectory of our lives forever. My name is Arthur Vance, and I spent over 2 decades working as a lead homicide investigator in the heart of Georgia. My entire reputation was built on staying completely ice cold while every single thing around me descended into absolute chaos and violent madness. I walked through nightmare scenes that would give normal people lifelong trauma, but I learned to never let my face show a single grain of emotion. Maintaining absolute self-control was always my greatest weapon. But on that specific evening, sitting across from my daughter Clara and her husband, I discovered that self-control feels remarkably like agonizing helplessness when the person being hurt is your child. Clara is 31 now, possessing a deep inner strength that she rarely gives herself credit for. She inherited her mother's gentle smile and my stubborn nature, which unfortunately makes her stay in bad situations far longer than she should. 4 years ago, she married a man named Julian Vance during an overly lavish ceremony that cost far more money than I ever believed was reasonable for a single day. I stood next to her that afternoon, feeling immensely proud, even though something about Julian never truly felt right to my instincts. Julian always came across as a polished professional on the surface, but his actual personality lacked genuine human warmth. His handshakes always dragged on just a bit too long, his smiles felt rehearsed in front of a mirror, and his eyes never reflected the words coming out of his mouth. He worked as a middle manager for a large regional supply hub in Duluth and carried himself like a man who believed he was far smarter than everyone else. His mother, Evelyn, possessed an equally controlling personality, running an unlicensed child care operation from her home while constantly meddling in their marriage. The evening everything finally exploded was meant to be a simple celebration for Clara's birthday at a steakhouse in Duluth. I booked the table, picked up the tab, and sincerely hoped we could enjoy a quiet family dinner together. But heavy tension began filling the room early, humming quietly before turning into something far more dangerous. Julian made a passive-aggressive comment about Clara spending the previous weekend at my house helping me organize her deceased mother's belongings. His voice was smooth, but the underlying cruelty behind his words was impossible to miss. My professional training kicked in immediately, forcing me to pay attention to every single detail, and just like I used to on active crime scenes. I watched the sudden change in Clara's posture as her shoulders curved inward to make herself smaller, while Julian's jaw visibly tightened with anger. Evelyn watched the entire interaction with a disturbing look of satisfaction, almost as if she had been eagerly anticipating a public confrontation. That was when Julian suddenly reached across the white tablecloth, not to show affection, but to aggressively grab Clara by the base of her hair. He yanked her head back with enough force to cause a sharp gasp that echoed through the surrounding dining room. Clara froze completely, her body going entirely rigid in that heartbreaking way victims do when they feel completely trapped and helpless. But what truly shattered my heart was not just his sudden act of violence, but the reaction from his mother. Evelyn casually leaned back in her leather chair, crossed her arms with a smirk, and loudly stated that Clara needed to learn her place in the marriage. Dozens of restaurant patrons turned their heads, awkwardly looking away while pretending not to notice the abuse occurring right next to them. Every biological instinct in my body screamed at me to jump across the table and destroy him, but I forced myself to stay seated. Instead of using violence, I reached into my leather jacket, pulled out my mobile phone, and silently started recording a high-definition video. Decades on the force taught me that unchecked anger destroys solid cases, so I held the camera perfectly still while capturing his face and his mother's words. After capturing several seconds of undeniable evidence, I lowered the phone, called the waiter over in a flat tone, and paid the bill in cash. I stood up from the table, looked Clara directly in the eyes, and told her to grab her coat immediately. She hesitated for a brief second, glancing back and forth between her husband and his mother, but the solemn expression on my face made her follow me. We walked out of the establishment together without saying another word to the people left sitting at that table. When we reached my truck in the dark parking lot, Clara sat in the passenger seat trembling uncontrollably while staring straight ahead at the dashboard. I gently informed her that I had recorded the entire incident on video, which caused her to go completely silent for several long moments. That was when I asked the crucial question that I desperately needed answered, asking if this was the very first time he had ever laid hands on her. Her complete inability to look at me provided the answer, eventually confessing that the subtle physical abuse had been occurring for well over a year. Hearing her admit that this was a repeated pattern shifted the situation from an isolated family argument into a structured criminal case. I took her straight back to my house that night, wrapping her in one of her mother-old woven blankets before she eventually fell asleep on the couch. I sat at my kitchen table for hours watching the clear footage over and over to ensure every action was fully visible before contacting trusted colleagues in the legal system. The following morning, we launched a methodical legal response that completely blindsided Julian and his family. I secured a top attorney, filed formal police reports, and provided the digital evidence alongside security footage requested from the steakhouse management within 48 hours. A judge granted an emergency protective order while local authorities officially charged Julian with misdemeanor assault. But the consequences of his actions did not stop with the criminal justice system, because facts have a way of unraveling fragile lives very quickly. We ensured his corporate employer was formally notified of the pending criminal charges and incoming evidence, resulting in his immediate suspension from his management position. Simultaneously, Evelyn Home Child Care Business was reported to state licensing authorities alongside the video footage demonstrating her active encouragement of domestic violence. State inspectors opened an immediate investigation, and once the surrounding parents learned about the situation, every single family pulled their children out within days. Everything they had built on a foundation of control and manipulation began to completely collapse around them. Clara stayed at my house throughout the entire ordeal, slowly rebuilding her confidence through honest conversations and quiet support. We organized her financial records, documented past incidents, and established a bulletproof timeline that proved a long history of domestic coercion. When presented with the overwhelming mountain of evidence during initial court proceedings, Julian's arrogance completely vanished into thin air. He quickly signed all settlement documents without fighting, granting Clara a full divorce and agreeing to a permanent restraining order. By the end of the month, the nightmare was legally over, and my daughter was finally free from his control. A few weeks later, Clara sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked why I chose not to physically attack Julian inside the restaurant that night. I looked at her and explained that reacting with violence would have turned me into the criminal, shifting all attention away from his abusive behavior. I chose to use the law as my weapon because physical strength temporary, but solid documented evidence lasts forever. Taking out my phone instead of using my fists was the only decision that guaranteed her long-term safety and freedom. Clara is slowly putting her life back together now, learning how to smile without fear lingering in the back of her mind. The house feels remarkably warmer whenever she comes over, and I can finally see a genuine sense of peace returning to her eyes. Looking back on my entire life, I realized that the most important investigation I ever conducted was not solved in an interrogation room. It was the case I built right at my own dinner table to save my daughter's life.